The Christmas lights were already up on Yosemite Avenue that December afternoon in 1972. Merced, California was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked and children walked home from school without a second thought. It was the kind of place where everyone knew the Stayner family, Del and Kay, and their 5 children. Steven was the baby of the bunch at 7 years old, with a gap-toothed smile that could light up the whole Central Valley. On December 4th, Steven left Charles Wright Elementary School at 2:15 p.m., just like always. His older brother Kerry had football practice. His sisters were at their own activities. Steven would walk the familiar route home alone, past the corner store where Mr. Henderson always waved, past the yellow house with the barking German shepherd, past the empty lot where kids played stickball on weekends. But that afternoon, Steven Stayner never made it home. Kay Stayner was peeling potatoes for dinner when she glanced at the kitchen clock. 3:30. Steven should have been home by now, tracking mud through a clean kitchen, asking for cookies before dinner. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to the front porch. The street was empty except for old Mrs. Garrett watering her roses next door. "Have you seen Steven?" Kay called out. Mrs. Garrett shook her head, but she wasn't worried yet. Boys wandered. Boys got distracted. Boys stopped to throw rocks at fence posts and chase stray cats. But as the sun began to sink behind the almond orchards, painting the sky the color of blood oranges, Kay's chest tightened with a mother's instinct that something was terribly, terribly wrong. By 5 p.m., Del Stayner had driven every street in a 5-mile radius. By 6 p.m., they'd called the police. By midnight, half the town was out with flashlights, calling Steven's name into the December darkness. Their voices echoed off the empty fields, swallowed by the vast California night. What happens to a family when the youngest child simply vanishes? What happens when days turn to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years? The Stayners were about to find out. And 7 years later, when the truth finally emerged, it would be more horrifying than anything they could have imagined. 3 hours before Steven disappeared, a white Bic had been circling the streets near Charles Wright Elementary. Behind the wheel sat Kenneth Parnell, 40 years old, with thinning hair and eyes that never quite met yours when he talked. Parnell worked the night shift at the Yosemite Lodge, but he'd called in sick that day. He had other plans. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Irvin Edward Murphy, a simple man who worked odd jobs and struggled to make friends. Murphy didn't know why Parnell had asked him to come along for a drive, but Parnell had been kind to him, one of the few people who had. Parnell had told Murphy a story about needing to find a boy for a church group, a boy who needed guidance, needed saving. Murphy, who'd never had much education and trusted too easily, believed every word. They'd been watching the school for 3 days. Parnell had pointed out different children, dismissing them one by one. Too old, too tough-looking, too many friends. Then on Monday afternoon, he saw Steven Stayner walking alone, kicking a pine cone along the sidewalk, his Partridge family lunchbox swinging at his side. "That one," Parnell said, his voice flat as old paint. "The little one in the red jacket." Murphy shifted uncomfortably. "He looks awful young, Ken." "That's the point," Parnell replied. "Young ones adapt better. Trust me. I used to be a minister. I know about saving souls." Parnell had never been a minister. He'd been many things: a cook, a clerk, a convicted child molester who'd somehow slipped through the cracks of the system, but never a minister. What he was, at his core, was a predator who understood exactly how to manipulate both children and the adults who might protect them. At 2:25 p.m., Murphy pulled the Bic alongside Steven. The boy looked up, squinting in the afternoon sun. Murphy rolled down the window, his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. "Hey there, son," Murphy said, reading from the script Parnell had made him memorize. "I'm a friend of your parents. Your mother asked me to pick you up. She's at the house helping with a church fundraiser." Steven stopped walking. His mother was always helping with church things. That was true. But she always told him in advance if plans changed. The man in the car looked nervous, sweating despite the December chill. "I'm supposed to walk home," Steven said, taking a small step backward. From the back seat, Parnell leaned forward. He had a badge, fake, but convincing to a 7-year-old's eyes. "It's okay, Steven. I'm Reverend Parnell. Your mother sent us because there's been a family emergency. Nothing serious, but she needs you to come with us." The word emergency did it. Steven's grandfather had been sick. Maybe something had happened. Maybe his mom needed him. He was 7 years old, raised to respect adults, raised to help in emergencies. He climbed into the back seat of the white Bic. Murphy's hands shook as he put the car in drive. In the rearview mirror, he watched the school disappear. Beside him, Parnell lit a cigarette, as calm as if they'd just picked up groceries. "Good job, Muff," Parnell said. "You just helped save a soul." Steven knew something was wrong when they passed the turn for his street. Then they passed the church. Then they left Merced altogether, heading into the mountains. He pressed his face against the window, watching familiar landmarks disappear into unfamiliar territory. "Where are we going?" His voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. "To your new home," Parnell said, not turning around. "Your parents can't take care of you anymore, Steven. They signed papers giving you to me. I'm your legal guardian now." "That's not true." Steven's eyes filled with tears. "My mom wouldn't do that. My dad wouldn't. They had to, son." Parnell's voice took on a false sympathy that would become sickeningly familiar over the years. "They have too many kids. They can't afford to feed all of you. But don't worry. You'll be happy with me. I'll take good care of you." The cabin in Cathy's Valley was 40 miles from Merced, but it might as well have been on another planet. Hidden in the Sierra foothills, surrounded by manzanita and scrub oak, it was the kind of place where nobody asked questions. Parnell had rented it specifically for this purpose, isolated enough to hide a child, but close enough to civilization that he could maintain his job, his facade of normalcy. Inside, the cabin smelled of cigarette smoke and old wood. There was a small living room with a television, a kitchenette, and 2 bedrooms. Parnell had prepared the smaller bedroom weeks in advance. Comic books on the nightstand, a few toys scattered on the dresser, even a poster of the Oakland A's on the wall. "This is your room now," Parnell said, pushing Steven inside. "And from now on, your name isn't Steven anymore. It's Dennis. Dennis Gregory Parnell. You're my son." Steven stood in the middle of the room, his Partridge family lunchbox still clutched in his hands. "I want to go home. I want my mom. Your mother doesn't want you anymore." Parnell's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold underneath. Then it was back, the concerned father figure. "But I want you, Dennis. I chose you. Isn't that better? To be chosen instead of just born into a family that doesn't care." That first night, Steven cried himself to sleep, still wearing his red jacket, still clutching his lunchbox. He could hear Parnell in the next room, watching television, occasionally laughing at something. Outside, coyotes howled in the darkness. Steven pulled the unfamiliar blankets over his head and whispered his real name over and over, like a prayer, like a promise to himself that he wouldn't forget. But forgetting, as he would learn, was sometimes the only way to survive. Back in Merced, the Stayner house had become command central for what was quickly becoming one of the largest searches in Central California history. Police officers came and went at all hours. Volunteers gathered in the living room to coordinate search grids. The phone rang constantly, tips, false sightings, cranks, and well-meaning neighbors offering casseroles and prayers. Kay Stayner hadn't slept in 3 days. She sat at the kitchen table, addressing flyers with Steven's school photo, the one from picture day just 2 months earlier. He was wearing his favorite shirt, the one with the rainbow stripes. His smile showed the gap where he'd lost a tooth the week before. Missing, Steven Gregory Stayner, age 7, brown hair, brown eyes. Last seen December 4th, 1972. Del Stayner drove the streets until his truck ran out of gas, then filled it up and drove some more. He checked every abandoned building, every empty lot, every place a small boy might hide or be hidden. He knocked on doors of strangers, showing them Steven's photo until the edges wore soft from handling. Someone must have seen something, he told Detective Pat Holford for the 100th time. Kids don't just disappear. But in 1972, before Amber Alerts and milk carton campaigns, before 24-hour news cycles and social media, children did sometimes just disappear. The FBI was called in, but their resources were limited. There was no national database for missing children, no systematic way to track predators across state lines. Kerry, Steven's 11-year-old brother, stopped eating. He'd been the one who was supposed to walk Steven home that day but had stayed for football practice instead. The guilt ate at him like acid. Their sisters, Cindy, Jody, and Coy, moved through the house like ghosts, afraid to laugh, afraid to play, afraid that being normal might somehow mean they'd forgotten Steven. The town rallied around the Stayners. Search parties combed the orchards and fields. Psychics called with visions. The story made the newspapers in Sacramento, San Francisco, even Los Angeles. But as December turned to January, as the rains came and washed away any trace of footprints or evidence, hope began to fade. A detective told Kay, gently, that they needed to consider the possibility that Steven was no longer alive. Kay slapped him hard. Then she went back to making flyers. "He's out there," she said to anyone who would listen. "A mother knows. He's out there, and he needs me to keep looking." 3 months into his captivity, Steven stopped crying every night. 6 months in, he stopped asking to go home. By his 8th birthday, which Parnell celebrated on a different date with a store-bought cake and presents, Steven had learned the rules of survival in Kenneth Parnell's world. Rule 1. His name was Dennis. Using his old name meant punishment, not physical violence, usually, but something worse. Parnell would withdraw affection, ignore him for days, leave him alone in the cabin with no food except peanut butter and stale bread. For a child desperate for any kind of stability, any kind of parental figure, the emotional manipulation was devastating. Rule 2. The story was everything. If anyone asked, Kenneth Parnell was his father. His mother had died. They'd moved to California from Arkansas for a fresh start. Steven, Dennis, memorized the lies until they felt almost real. Rule 3. Don't run. Where would he go? Parnell had convinced him that his parents had given him away, that the police had helped arrange the adoption. If he went to the authorities, they'd just bring him back. Otherwise, they'd put him in an orphanage where nobody would want him. Parnell was clever in his manipulation. He wasn't always cruel. There were days when he was almost kind, taking Dennis to the movies, buying him ice cream, teaching him to ride a bike. He enrolled him in school under the name Dennis Parnell, and nobody questioned it. Record-keeping was lax. A man with a boy who looked enough like him to be his son didn't raise eyebrows. But there were other days. Dark days. Days when Parnell drank too much and his mask slipped completely. Days when being Dennis wasn't enough. When Parnell wanted something else. Something that left Steven feeling hollow and broken in ways he didn't have words for. On those days, Steven learned to disappear inside himself, to go somewhere else in his mind, back to his real home, his real family, even though the memories were starting to fade like photographs left in the sun. At school, Dennis Parnell was a quiet student. Teachers noted that he was bright but withdrawn. He didn't make close friends. How could he? His entire life was a lie. Sometimes he'd watch other children get picked up by their mothers and feel a pain so sharp it took his breath away. But he'd learned not to cry. Crying didn't change anything. As months turned to years, the boy called Dennis grew taller. His voice began to change, and the memories of Steven Stayner became something like a dream, something that might have been real once but felt impossible now. Parnell moved them frequently, always staying one step ahead of anyone who might ask too many questions. From Cathy's Valley to Santa Rosa, from Santa Rosa to Willits, always Northern California, always isolated places where people minded their own business. In Merced, time moved differently for the Stayners. It was measured not in ordinary days, but in days without Steven. 100 days, 500 days, 1,000 days. Each anniversary of his disappearance was marked with renewed searches, renewed pleas to the media, renewed hope that somehow, somewhere, someone would recognize their boy. Kay Stayner aged a decade and 2 years. Her brown hair went gray at the temples. Lines etched themselves around her eyes from squinting at every young boy she passed on the street, wondering, hoping, inevitably being disappointed. She kept Steven's room exactly as he'd left it, his baseball glove on the dresser, his homework from December 3rd still on his desk, half finished. Dell threw himself into work, taking extra shifts at the cannery, coming home exhausted and falling asleep in his chair with a beer in his hand. He and Kay grew distant, each grieving in their own way, unable to comfort each other because they could barely hold themselves together. The other children suffered in silence. Cindy, the oldest, took on a maternal role, trying to fill the gap left by parents consumed with loss. Carrie's guilt metamorphosed into something darker, an anger that had nowhere to go. He started getting into fights at school, his grades plummeting. Jody and Corey, the younger girls, grew up in a house where joy felt like betrayal, where laughing too loud might mean you'd forgotten that Steven was gone. Every lead was followed, every tip investigated. There was the boy in Fresno who looked like Steven but turned out to be a runaway from Oregon. The boy in San Diego whose age was right but whose eyes were blue, not brown. The skeletal remains found in the foothills that turned out to be decades old. Each false hope was another wound that wouldn't heal. The police scaled back the investigation. Not officially. Officially, the case remained open and active. But the reality was that resources were limited. Other children went missing. Other cases demanded attention. Detective Holford still kept Steven's file on his desk, still occasionally made calls. But even he had begun to use the past tense when talking about the boy. In 1976, 4 years after Steven's disappearance, a reporter asked Kay if she considered holding a memorial service, finding closure. Kay's response made the evening news. You don't hold a funeral for someone who isn't dead. And my boy isn't dead. He's out there, and is waiting for me to find him. By 1979, Dennis Parnell was 14 years old. He stood 5'6". His voice had changed, and he'd learned to navigate Parnell's world with the exhausted expertise of a longtime prisoner. He attended Willits High School, where he was known as a loner who sometimes smoked behind the gym and had a part-time job at a local pizza place. The memories of his life before had faded to impressions. The smell of his mother's perfume, the sound of his father's truck in the driveway, the feeling of belonging somewhere. Sometimes at night, he tried to remember his siblings' names, their faces, but they slipped away like water through his fingers. Parnell had become increasingly paranoid as Dennis grew older. The boy was starting to look less like a child who could be easily controlled and more like a young man who might fight back. Parnell had started giving him alcohol, sometimes pills, anything to keep him docile, dependent. He'd also become more possessive, more demanding, the mask of the caring father figure barely maintained anymore. But Parnell had a problem. Dennis was aging out of his preference. The sick attraction that had driven him to kidnap a 7-year-old wasn't there for a 14-year-old. He'd started looking again, cruising past elementary schools, watching playgrounds. He needed someone new, someone younger. Dennis noticed the change. After 7 years, he could read Parnell's moods like a weather vane. He recognized the hunting behavior, the distracted air, the way Parnell would come home and look at him with disappointment, like a toy that had lost its appeal. Part of him was relieved. Maybe Parnell would finally let him go. But another part, a part that understood Parnell in ways that made him sick, knew what was coming. On February 14th, 1980, Valentine's Day, Parnell came home with someone new. The boy was tiny, maybe 5 years old, with white blonde hair and huge, frightened eyes. He stood in the doorway of the cabin clutching a stuffed animal, tears streaming down his face. "Dennis," Parnell said, his voice bright with false cheer. "Meet your new little brother. His name is Tommy." But Dennis had heard the boy whisper his real name through his tears. Timmy. Timmy White. The parallels were sickening. Parnell had used the same story. The parents who couldn't care for him anymore, the legal adoption, the new life that would be better than the old one. He'd even used the same accomplice, Sean Pullman this time, another simple-minded man who'd believed Parnell's lies about rescuing a neglected child. Dennis watched Parnell go through the same routine. The false kindness, the new clothes, the toys meant to distract from the prison bars that weren't made of metal but were just as real. He watched Timmy cry himself to sleep that first night, just as he had 7 years ago, and something inside him that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten it existed suddenly roared to life. He couldn't let this happen again. Not to another child. Not to Timmy. The next morning, while Parnell was at work, Dennis sat with Timmy at the kitchen table. The little boy wouldn't eat, wouldn't stop crying for his mother. "Hey," Dennis said softly. "I know you're scared. I know you want to go home." Timmy looked up at him with those huge eyes. "The man said my parents don't want me anymore." He's lying. The words came out before Dennis could stop them. It was the first time in 7 years he'd acknowledged out loud that Parnell was a liar. "Your parents want you. They're looking for you right now." "How do you know?" Dennis was quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 7 years, he said it, "Because the same thing happened to me. My name isn't Dennis. It's Steven Stayner, and I've been here for 7 years." Saying his real name out loud after so long felt like breaking a spell. It felt like waking up from a nightmare. It felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. But it also felt dangerous. Parnell would be home in 6 hours. And Dennis, Steven, had to figure out what to do next. For 2 weeks, Steven played a desperate game. During the day, while Parnell was at work, he'd comfort Timmy, tell him stories, try to keep him calm. He'd whisper promises that he'd get them both out, that Timmy would see his mother again. At night, when Parnell returned, Steven would pretend everything was normal, that he was still Dennis, still the obedient son. But Parnell wasn't stupid. He could sense the shift in Steven, the way he'd positioned himself as Timmy's protector. He started taking Timmy to work with him, leaving Steven alone in the cabin. The message was clear: don't try anything. Steven used those alone hours to plan. He'd been so young when he was taken, he didn't even know his home phone number. But Timmy did. Timmy knew his address, his parents' names, everything they'd need to get him home. The question was how. Parnell had chosen Willits partly for its isolation. The cabin was miles from town, surrounded by forest. Steven had no car, no money beyond the few dollars he'd saved from his pizza job. And he had 7 years of conditioning telling him that nobody would believe him, nobody would help him, that Parnell would always find him. But every night, he looked at Timmy, so small, so scared, so much like Steven had been, and the determination grew stronger. He started testing boundaries, walking a little farther from the cabin each day, talking to people in town, gauging who might help and who might call Parnell. On February 28th, Parnell made a mistake. He'd been drinking heavily, passed out on the couch by 9 p.m. His wallet had fallen from his pocket, and Steven saw it. $40 in cash. Not much, but maybe enough. Steven shook Timmy awake. "We're leaving. Right now." "Where are we going?" "Home. We're going home." March 1st, 1980. 2:47 a.m. Steven carried Timmy on his back through the darkness. The 5-year-old was exhausted, frightened, clinging to Steven's neck as they stumbled through the woods toward the lights of Willits. Steven had no real plan beyond getting to town, finding a phone, calling someone, anyone, who could help. They hitchhiked part of the way, Steven making up a story about their car breaking down. The driver, a long-haul trucker, didn't ask too many questions, Just dropped them at the edge of Ukiah as the sun was coming up. Steven had been there before with Parnell. He knew there was a police station somewhere downtown. But standing on the street in the early morning light, Steven froze. 7 years of programming kicked in. What if the police didn't believe him? What if they called Parnell? What if his parents really had given him up? Timmy was crying again, cold and hungry and scared. I want my mommy. Those 3 words cut through 7 years of fear and manipulation. Steven picked up Timmy and started walking. They found a police station on Low Gap Road, just as it was opening for the morning shift. Steven stood at the desk, Timmy in his arms, and faced Officer Bob Warner. His mouth was dry. His hands were shaking. 7 years of lies and truth battled in his throat. I know my first name is Steven, he finally said, his voice cracking. I'm pretty sure my last name is Stayner. I was kidnapped 7 years ago from Merced. This is Timmy White. He was kidnapped 2 weeks ago. We need help. Officer Warner stared at the teenager in front of him, thin, exhausted, holding a small boy who was clearly terrified. He'd heard of Steven Stayner. Every cop in California had. The boy who'd vanished 7 years ago, whose parents still called looking for updates, whose case had gone ice cold. Son, Warner said carefully, are you telling me you're Steven Stayner from Merced? Yes, sir. And the man who took us is Kenneth Parnell. He's probably looking for us right now. Warner picked up his phone. Within minutes, the station was in controlled chaos. Calls to Merced PD, to the FBI, to Child Services. Someone brought Steven and Timmy sandwiches and hot chocolate. A female officer sat with Timmy, letting him call his parents while Steven watched, tears streaming down his face at the joy in the little boy's voice. Then it was Steven's turn. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a woman's voice, tired, cautious, hello. Mom. Steven's voice broke completely. Mom, it's me. It's Steven. Silence. Then a sound like breaking glass, like 7 years of grief shattering all at once. Steven. Oh my God. Oh my God. Steven, is it really you? It's me, Mom. I'm coming home. The reunion at the Ukiah police station was chaos, tears, embraces, disbelief. Kay Stayner hadn't recognized the teenager who claimed to be her son until he smiled that gap-toothed smile. The tooth had grown in, but the expression was the same. Dell stood back, overwhelmed, watching his wife hold their son like she'd never let go again. But even in those first moments of joy, there were signs of the challenge ahead. Steven flinched when Dell tried to hug him. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting Parnell to appear. He lit a cigarette without thinking, then crushed it out when he saw his mother's shocked expression. The media descended like locusts. The boy who came home. Headlines screamed. 7-year nightmare ends. Reporters camped outside the Stayner home. Talk shows called. Movie producers sent telegrams. Steven Stayner became a household name overnight, but he was also still a traumatized 14-year-old who didn't know how to be Steven anymore. The house felt impossibly small. His siblings were strangers. Carrie, now 18, looked at him with a mixture of relief and something else. Resentment, maybe. That Steven's return meant the spotlight that had finally shifted to the other Stayner children would swing back to the missing boy, now found. The girls, his sisters, didn't know how to act around him. He was their brother, but he was also a stranger who smoked and drank and had eyes that had seen too much. Steven tried to settle back into normal life. He enrolled at Merced High School, but he was years behind academically. More than that, he was a kid everyone whispered about. The kidnapped boy. The one who'd lived with that man for 7 years. The one who'd done. What? Nobody said it out loud, but Steven could see the questions in their eyes. He couldn't sleep in his old room. It felt like a museum to a 7-year-old who no longer existed. He'd pace the house at night, checking locks, looking out windows. Sometimes he'd wake up forgetting where he was, expecting to see Parnell's face, and the relief when he remembered he was home was almost as overwhelming as the fear. The hardest part was the unspoken questions. His parents never asked what had happened during those 7 years. They couldn't bring themselves to hear it, and Steven couldn't bring himself to tell them. The silence grew between them like a cancer, all the things that couldn't be said poisoning what should have been a happy ending. Kenneth Parnell was arrested on March 2, 1980. He was charged with kidnapping and false imprisonment. Notably, he was not charged with what he'd actually done to Steven during those 7 years. The laws around child sexual abuse were different then. The statute of limitations had passed on some crimes, and prosecutors worried about putting Steven through the trauma of testifying about those details. The trial was a circus. Steven did testify, briefly, identifying Parnell as his kidnapper. He kept his answers short, factual, his eyes never meeting Parnell's. When asked about the 7 years, he simply said, "He told me my parents didn't want me anymore. He made me believe it." Parnell's defense was obscene in its audacity. He claimed he'd rescued Steven from a neglectful home, that he'd given him a good life, educated him, cared for him. He painted himself as a misunderstood father figure, someone who just wanted to help a child in need. The sentence, when it came, was a slap in the face to everything Steven had endured: 7 years in prison, the maximum for kidnapping at the time. With good behavior, Parnell would serve 5 years. For 7 years of Steven's childhood. For the trauma that would never fully heal. For the family that had been shattered and could never quite be put back together the same way. Steven left the courthouse that day and punched a wall so hard he broke his hand. The physical pain was almost a relief. Something real. Something that made sense. Unlike a justice system that valued his 7 years of hell at less than a year each in prison time. Timmy White's parents invited Steven to visit. Timmy called him his hero, and maybe that was worth something. Maybe saving Timmy made the 7 years mean something. But heroes in stories don't wake up screaming. Heroes don't flinch when someone touches them unexpectedly. Heroes don't feel like strangers in their own homes. The year after Steven's return was harder than anyone expected. The media attention faded, but the trauma remained. The Stayner family had built their lives around Steven's absence, routines, relationships, dynamics that had evolved over 7 years. His return didn't reset things to 1972. It created an entirely new reality that no one knew how to navigate. Steven tried to be normal. He dated a girl named Jody Edmondson, not to be confused with his sister Jody, someone who didn't look at him like he was broken. He got a job at a local pizza place, the normal kind, not like the one in Willits. He tried to catch up in school, but sitting in a classroom felt suffocating. How could he care about algebra when he'd learned to survive with a predator? The family went to therapy, briefly. But talking about feelings wasn't something the Stayners did well even before the kidnapping. Dell believed in working through problems, not talking about them. Kay wanted to pretend the 7 years hadn't happened, that her baby boy was home and everything could go back to normal. But normal was impossible. Steven drank too much, had been drinking since he was 11, courtesy of Parnell. He'd disappear for hours, sending Kay into panic spirals. He'd come home to find her crying, terrified he'd been taken again, and the guilt would eat at him. But he couldn't stand being watched all the time. Couldn't stand the weight of being the returned son, the miracle, the boy who came back. His siblings struggled too. Carrie, especially, seemed to resent the attention Steven received. "I was here," he said once, drunk at a family barbecue. "I was here the whole time, but all anyone could think about was Steven. And now he's back, and it's still all about Steven." The guilt from that, the knowledge that his disappearance had stolen not just his childhood but parts of his siblings too, was almost unbearable. In 1984, Steven dropped out of high school. He couldn't do it anymore, couldn't pretend to be a regular teenager when he'd never gotten to be a regular child. He married Jody Edmondson in 1985, at just 20 years old. They had 2 children, Ashley and Steven Jr. Creating his own family, he thought, might help him understand how to be part of one again. By 1989, Steven had found a measure of peace. Not happiness exactly, but something like stability. He worked as a pizza delivery driver, spent time with his children, tried to be the father to them that Parnell had pretended to be to him. Accept real, accept genuine, accept safe. He'd spoken at schools about stranger danger, turning his trauma into something that might protect other children. He'd consulted on a TV movie about his story, I Know My First Name is Steven, though watching his life recreated on screen was surreal and painful. Timmy White, now 14, the same age Steven had been when he'd rescued him, would visit sometimes. They had a bond that no one else could understand. Timmy was doing well, a normal kid who got to grow up with his real family because Steven had been brave enough to run that night in March. On September 16, 1989, Steven was riding his motorcycle home from work. It was a clear evening, the kind where the Central Valley heat finally breaks and you can breathe again. He was thinking about Ashley's upcoming birthday, about the weekend plans with Jody, about ordinary things that once seemed impossible. A car ran a red light. Steven tried to avoid it, but there wasn't time. The impact threw him from his motorcycle. He wasn't wearing a helmet. They weren't required by law then. He died on impact. He was 24 years old. Steven Stayner's death made headlines around the world. The boy who'd survived 7 years of captivity, who'd saved another child, who'd fought so hard to build a normal life, gone at 24 in a senseless accident. The irony was cruel and devastating. He'd survived Kenneth Parnell, but he couldn't survive a drunk driver running a red light in Merced. The funeral was standing room only. Teachers who'd worried about the quiet boy named Dennis. Police officers who'd worked his case. Strangers who'd followed his story and felt like they knew him. Timmy White, now 14, served as a pallbearer alongside Steven's brothers. The boy who'd been saved carrying the man who'd saved him. Kay Stayner, who'd spent 7 years praying for her son's return, now faced a different kind of loss. One with no hope of return, no possibility of miracle. I got him back for 9 years, she told reporters through her tears. 9 years isn't enough, but it was everything. But Steven's death was not the end of the Stayner family's nightmare. It was, horrifically, just another chapter. For the Stayner family, Steven's kidnapping and eventual return was a wound that never fully healed. His parents struggled with guilt and grief, his siblings with confusion and anger. Even after Steven's tragic death in 1989, the shadows of his ordeal still clung to them. But no one could have imagined how deep that darkness would run. Steven's older brother, Cary Stayner, seemed on the surface to be quiet and withdrawn, the opposite of Steven's bold survival story. Yet behind closed doors, Cary carried his own demons. For years he battled mental health issues, feelings of neglect, and an unshakable bitterness at the attention Steven had received. In 1999, 2 decades after Steven's kidnapping shocked California, Cary unleashed his own horror on the world. Working as a handyman near Yosemite National Park, he lured and murdered 4 women in a series of crimes so brutal they horrified the nation. The irony was unbearable. One brother abducted as a child, fighting desperately to save others. The other growing into a man who became the predator himself. For the Stayner family, it was a second tragedy, not as sudden as Steven's kidnapping, but just as devastating. Cary's crimes forever linked the family name with violence and sorrow. Where Steven had symbolized survival and courage, Cary came to represent the lasting scars of trauma, festering untreated until they turned inward and destructive. Ashley and Steven Jr., Steven's children, grew up knowing their father as a hero in the public eye and as a loving, if troubled, dad in their private memories. Ashley was only 3 when he died. Steven Jr. was barely 2. They learned about their father's story from news reports and the 1989 TV movie that played in reruns. Jody Stayner, Steven's widow, remarried and tried to give the children a normal life. But normal was elusive for the Stayner family. The name carried weight, expectations, the shadow of tragedy. People expect you to be either damaged or heroic, Ashley would say years later. But we were just kids who lost our dad. That's its own kind of trauma. Timmy White, meanwhile, grew up to become a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy. He dedicated his career to protecting children, inspired by the teenager who'd risked everything to save him. He speaks publicly about Steven when asked, always with reverence, always with gratitude. Steven Stayner saved my life, he says. Not just from Kenneth Parnell, but he gave me the chance to have a life at all, to grow up with my real family, to become who I was supposed to become. Kenneth Parnell served only 5 years of his 7-year sentence. Released in 1985, he disappeared into obscurity for a while. But predators rarely change, and Parnell was no exception. In 2003, now in his 70s, he was arrested for attempting to purchase a 4-year-old boy from the child's mother for $500. The arrest made national news, reminding the world that the monster who'd stolen Steven Stayner was still alive, still dangerous. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life. It was too little, too late, justice delayed by decades. Parnell died in prison in 2008, at age 76. Steven had been dead for 19 years by then. The man who'd stolen 7 years of Steven's childhood, who'd set in motion a chain of events that would destroy an entire family, had outlived his victim by nearly 2 decades. Today, Steven Stayner's story is taught in schools as a cautionary tale about stranger danger. His name appears on missing children's websites as an example of hope, proof that sometimes the lost do come home. But those who reduce his story to a simple morality tale miss the deeper, more complex truth. Steven Stayner's real legacy isn't just that he escaped. It's that in his darkest moment, when he could have given up, when he could have let despair win, he chose to save someone else. He chose to be brave not for himself. He'd learned to survive Parnell's world, but for a 5-year-old boy who reminded him of who he used to be. The Merced Courthouse has a small plaque honoring Steven's heroism. The elementary school he attended has a memorial garden. But perhaps the most fitting tribute is the quiet work done by people like Timmy White, protecting children, carrying forward the lessons Steven taught, that sometimes the most broken people are capable of the greatest acts of love. Steven Stayner was 7 years old when he was taken, 14 when he found the courage to escape, 24 when he died. In between, he lived a life that was by turns horrific and heroic, tragic and triumphant. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about trauma, about survival, about the price of heroism. There are no easy answers in Steven's story, no clean resolutions. The boy who saved Timmy White never fully saved himself. The family that got their son back never fully healed. The justice system that convicted his captain never adequately punished the crime. But maybe that's the point. Maybe Steven's story isn't about happy endings. Maybe it's about the courage to keep going even when going is impossible. Maybe it's about the choice to save someone else even when you can't save yourself. Maybe it's about the 7-year-old boy who never came home, and the young man who made sure another 7-year-old did. In Merced, California, there's a grave with Steven Stayner's name on it. The headstone reads, "Loving husband, father, son and brother." But if Steven could write his own epitaph, maybe it would say something simpler. He brought Timmy home. Sometimes, in a broken world, that's enough. Sometimes, that's everything. What would you have done if you were Steven? Would you have risked everything to save another child? Let me know in the comments. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more true stories the world must never forget.